there's going to be 2 billion people over the age of 65 by 2050. And these drugs are almost certainly longevity normalizing for those people.
Welcome back to Drug Diaries, listeners. If you have been tuning into our Aging and Longevity series, you know we've been on quite a journey. We've explored the frontiers of anti-aging research, debunked myths, and glimpsed into the future where growing older doesn't mean slowing down. Today, we are adding another fascinating chapter to this story. We're diving deep into the molecular mechanics of aging with none other than Professor Brian Kennedy.
Singapore has been very good at recognizing the challenge of aging, and so they put money aside to do research on that. I think that they're still struggling a bit to figure out what the right strategy is, but at least there's an awareness there.
mTOR pathway, it comes up a lot. Can you explain why it's so important for aging interventions? And where would you put metabolic age in the overall scheme of things? Because that is one parameter that has become easily accessible to a lot of the people because of all these digital health tech apps.
Understand that every dollar they put into longevity research is probably going to give them more bang for their buck than the money they put into cancer and other things. One thing you hear now, you start to hear precision longevity medicine. Not sure how to do that yet. We need to re-empower older people. We need to re-educate them. They want to stay in their jobs and they're effective. They need to be allowed to do that. We know that diabetes accelerates aging, and we know that obesity accelerates aging.
Brian, anti-aging treatments can be pretty pricey, or at least that's the perception. How can we make them more accessible to everyone?
I work with companies all the time, but we also need governments and regulatory agencies to get with the program. I don't think any intervention will slow aging in everyone. Yeah, maybe some form of exercise is good for everyone.
Buckle up. We are about to get a masterclass in the science of aging from one of the field's true pioneers. We're diving deep into the molecular mechanics of aging with none other than Professor Brian Kennedy. Welcome back to Drug Diaries, listeners. If you have been tuning into our Aging and Longevity series, you know we've been on quite a journey. We have explored the frontiers of anti-aging research, debunked myths, and glimpsed into a future where growing older doesn't mean slowing down. Today, we are adding another fascinating chapter to this story. We're diving deep into the molecular mechanics of aging with none other than Professor Brian Kennedy. Professor Brian Kennedy is a renowned scientist in the field of aging research. With a distinguished career spanning several decades, his work has significantly contributed to our understanding of the biology of aging and the potential interventions to promote healthy longevity. As a distinguished professor of biochemistry and physiology at the National University of Singapore and the former CEO of the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, his work has had a profound impact on understanding how we can delay aging and promote healthier, longer lives. But here's what set Brian's apart. He's not just about understanding aging, he's about doing something about it. From his groundbreaking work on rapamycin to his current studies on Alpha-Ketoglutarate, he's always pushing the boundaries for what's possible in extending a health span. And get this, he's not just working in the lab. Brian's been taking his discoveries from petri dishes to people, setting up human trials, and even founding companies to bring these innovations to the public. So whether you are a long-time listener of our longevity series or just joining us, buckle up. You're about to get a masterclass in science of aging from one of the field's true pioneers. Brian, welcome to Drug Diaries. It's an honor to have you on the show today.
Well, it's my pleasure. That was such a great introduction. Now I feel nervous.
I'm nervous, honestly. So, Brian, can you walk us through your career journey and how you became one of the leading figures in aging research?
Yeah, I think that it was like a lot of people when they start graduate school, they don't have some vision laid out for the future. But when I went to MIT to start my PhD, I wanted to continue to work in yeast cells, which would have, been really a workhorse model organism to understand biology. But I wanted to do something completely different in yeast. And so the opportunity came to work in Lenny Guarenti's lab. He was looking for new projects. And another graduate student, Nick Austriaco, who has since become a priest, but that's a different story. We decided to work on yeast aging. And at the time, really had no belief or even had never really thought about the idea of slowing human aging. It was really just to understand what drives the aging process. And we thought single cell yeast would be a simple organism to try to answer that question. And the rest sort of happened from there. We stumbled upon Sirtuins, published a paper on Sirtuins regulation of replicative aging in yeast. And then I went and did a postdoc in some cancer biology, working on nuclear lamins, actually, which turned out to be linked to progeria and accelerated aging, although we didn't know that at the time. And when I got back to the University of Washington as assistant professor, I wanted to go back to yeast aging because I figured if we found, the sirtuin pathway studying yeast, there must be a lot of other pathways out there as well. And then we started working with Matt Kaberlein, started working on mTOR among other pathways. And so what's shocking, I think, is that aging is so conserved. The things you understand in simple cell organisms can be conserved all the way up to humans. Those are arguably the two most prominent pathways in aging research right now. But as I progressed, I also felt like maybe we can do something about the human condition. Maybe we can extend health span. And so I've been trending much more translationally, especially recently. We're testing lots of different kinds of interventions to try to see if they slow aging and extend health span. We use a wide array of organisms from yeast to worms to flies, killifish, mice, and ultimately humans. And I also work with longevity clinics because some of these clinics are doing very interesting, often expensive things that I can't test in an academic setting. So we want to understand what kind of data is being collected at longevity clinics and what might be working and on the more exotic realm, I guess. So I guess the other thing that I've done recently is gotten very interested in aging clocks and biomarkers of aging, because those two things go together. Unless we have good measures of aging, we're not going to know whether our interventions work or not. So, that's sort of where I am now. And I really, I want to be one of the people that drives this field toward making an impact on human health.
You are making a very deep impact already, Brian. And looking back at your career, what do you feel has been your biggest aha moment in aging research?
I kind of alluded to it already, that the aging pathways are so highly evolutionarily conserved. It's turning on mTOR signaling extends lifespan across a wide spectrum of organisms. And I would argue there's increasing data that it works in humans. I don't think it was at all obvious that aging would be conserved at the time I started doing research. If you think about aging, it's often thought to be sort of what happens after natural selection goes away. You're optimized for fitness, which largely means reproduction. And once you get to 40, you raise kids, the selective pressure to keep you healthy declines, and then things fall apart. And if that's true, there's no a priori reason to think things fall apart the same way in all these different species. And yet the pathways that modulate aging seem to be conserved. And I think the reason for that is that each species has like an intricate network that tries to keep it functioning or healthy. And the interventions that slow aging really preserve the function of that network. And so they're not mitigating what happens when things go wrong. They're trying to preserve the homeostasis that exists. So I think that's a really striking observation that the field has made, and something that was perhaps not expected when we started.
I'm curious, how has your view on aging biology changed over the years?
So sure it's changed that much. I think that what may have changed, though, is the relative ease that it seems we can slow aging. I think when I started in around 1990 in grad school, we would go to meetings and the field would, I think if you took the collective temperature of the aging field, which was much, much smaller at the time, people would have said that, if you give us another 30 years of research and we'll understand what causes aging. It may not be possible to do anything about aging because it's so complicated, but we'll understand it at least. And yet here we are 30 years later, and it looks like there are lots of things we can do to slow aging, but we still arguably don't understand what's causing aging. Right. So it's been pretty much the opposite of what people expected. But I think it's clear, at least in the animal models, that it's relatively easy to extend lifespan and health span. Animals teach us a lot about humans, but they're not completely humans, of course. And so
Right.
there is some debate as to whether these interventions in humans will have effect of squaring the curve.
Hmm.
In other words, getting more people toward the maximum lifespan, but maybe not extending maximum lifespan. Or if they'll act like they do in animals and extend both median and maximum lifespan. I think we don't know the answer to that yet.
Right.
It's an interesting debate. In one sense, it doesn't matter. If we can square the curve and keep people healthy much longer, even if they die at 110, that's still a revolutionary change in medicine. The bigger question now is, can we really dramatically affect aging? Can we extend maximum lifespan? Can we stop or reverse aging? Completely unknown questions right now, and they still require a lot of basic biology, I think, to get to those answers.
Right. Can you break down the Sirtuin pathway for us? I hear it's a big deal in aging research.
Yeah, when we started, we found that the yeast Sirtuin, as the name of the gene, could affect aging by regulating recombination in the rDNA and affecting DNA replication. That was, I sort of left the lab at the time, and Lenny's lab, and then they went on to study sirtuins across a range of other species. It turns out there's 7 sirtuins, and Sirti1 and Sirti6 have gotten the most play with regard to aging, but Sirti3 and even Sirti2 may have a role as well. So these are protein deacetylases. So originally thought to be histone deacetylases, and they are, and they can't deacetylate histones and regulate transcription and other events in the nucleus, but they also can deacetylate other proteins in the cell. And some of them, for instance, are in the mitochondria. So they're regulatory proteins that can modulate a whole range of different cellular events and sometimes impinge upon aging.
What's got you excited in your lab at the National University of Singapore these days?
One of the things we're really excited about, and this is a collaboration with Jan Gruber and Falk Shum here in US, is we built a clinical aging clock. And so there are a number of biologic clocks. There are hundreds of them now. We can talk in detail about what they do. A lot of them involve omics, like DNA methylation. And I think those are very interesting, but they're challenging to move those clocks into the clinic because a lot of MDs are really not up to speed on omics. They're also not always up to speed on aging. And remarkably, aging is pretty much not taught in medical schools. The one thing that happens to everybody, and we seem to ignore it. And so if you go to a doctor and say there's 13 methylation sites, which are making me 10 years too old, and that's not actionable to them. And so what we did is we took the data in Haynes data set, which is a longitudinal study in the US, and they measured things you already know, LDL, HbA1c, inflammatory markers, medical questionnaires, medical histories. And we took all those parameters and said, can we predict mortality using an AI-based system? And it worked very well. And the nice thing is now we did that in a principal component strategy. And so different components track different disease states. So you can head down a metabolic disease state, or you can head down a frailty state. We can measure your mortality risk, infer backwards, get your biologic age. And then if it's high, we can see what trajectories are affected the most. And we have some trajectories that look like pure aging, and those involve inflammation largely. But the nice thing is when you go to a doctor and say, all right, here's 4 parameters. None of these parameters are out of the reference range on their own. So if you just look at this sheet, you're not going to prescribe any medicines. But if we look at the 4 of them together, we can infer that there's a higher mortality risk because there's accelerated aging. And these are treatable things. We can treat them now. We don't have to take someone with blood pressure of 130 and say, oh, well, it's a little high. But let's wait and, try to exercise a little bit more. Instead, we can take it seriously and either get people on a rigorous regime of exercise and diet or give them medication. And when the data shows that when you're more aggressive about doing those things, you get a better effect on survival. So.
Right. mTOR pathway. It comes up a lot. Can you explain why it's so important for aging interventions?
I think it's maybe a central node in this homeostatic network I was referring to that tries to keep you in equilibrium and keep you healthy. And there's a good reason to believe that. For instance, TOR is a protein kinase. and it exists in two complex, torque 1 and torque 2, but torque 1 seems to be the primary one that's affecting aging. And if you look at the signals that regulate that kinase, they're all the things that impact aging. Nutrient signaling, both amino acids and carbohydrates through insulin IGF. Stress, hypoxia. Many of the things that we know impact the aging process converge on this kinase. And then downstream of the kinase are protein synthesis, cell proliferation. That's when the kinase is activated. When it's inactivated, you turn up autophagy, damage control mechanisms, and improve mitochondrial function. So I think that it just keeps coming up over and over again. So we test a wide range of interventions, and certainly things like rapamycin directly impact mTOR. But when we look at other things, we almost always find that directly or indirectly they turn down mTOR signaling. So it may not be the only central node, but it's certainly one of the ones that are key to the aging process.
Right. And talking about biomarkers and interventions, if you had to pick, what's the most promising way to measure how fast someone's really aging?
Yeah, I think the biomarkers, I'm convinced they're very useful across population studies. The issue is, at an individual level, how valuable are they? And I think it's still a work in progress. There are first-generation clocks, like the Horvath clock, which tries to predict your chronologic age. There's second-generation clocks, like PhenoAge and GrimAge, and this clinical age clock, PCH, I just told you about.
Yes.
They try to predict mortality or some outcome, adverse outcome. And then there's third generation clocks and more. It's gone beyond that. But one example of that would be the Dunedin clock, which measures the pace of aging. So the other clocks attempt to measure the odometer that you have in your car. This one measures the speedometer. And I think that's very interesting as well. There are now Oregon clocks and other things. So it's kind of if you're just out there in the community wanting to measure your age, it's kind of complicated to know what to do. Ideally, and if people going to longevity clinics, I really encourage clinics to use multiple different kinds of clocks because to me, they're all measuring some aspects of aging, but they don't correlate extremely well with each other. And so they may be tipped toward different hallmarks of aging, each clock. And so but you get a better picture by looking across a range of them. Of course, that gets expensive, but in terms of accuracy, I think that's the best thing to do. But some of the other confusing things are that, people think of aging like chronologic age. They think biologic age is just going to go up and maybe you can change the slope a little bit, but it's just going to go up. But actually what happens when we look at these clocks is that they're oscillating.
Yes.
And so, if you get COVID, you look biologically older for a while. If you get an exercise program going, then you look biologically younger. So I think they're a compilation of multiple things. There probably is an intrinsic aging process that at least I don't think there's evidence we can reverse right now. Maybe that's damage. And then there's a secondary component, which is how are you functioning at that age? And that's what's influenced by all these lifestyle parameters and probably a lot of the interventions. And that probably oscillates one standard deviation around plus or minus 5 years of your biology. So these measures are complicated. And if you measure one person from over a period of time, they can look 10 years older one time and 5 years younger, so it varies. And so I think that one measure is probably not sufficient to know where you are. It probably takes a series of measures over a period of time. And I also would argue that a lot of these consumer-based companies, it's not entirely clear how reproducible their assays are. And Matt Kaberlein just spoke about this, and he sent in the same biologic samples to a company and got very different results back. And so I think that there's still a ways to go if you are the kind of person who wants to be entirely accurate and not spend your money unless you know exactly what you're getting. Maybe you need to wait a little bit. If you're more on the cutting edge and you want to get an indication of where you are and how you're changing over time, I think these clocks are worth doing. But it's still research for sure.
Right. And where would you put metabolic age in the overall scheme of things? Because that is one parameter that has become easily accessible to a lot of the people because of all these digital health tech apps. and people can measure their metabolic age. How reliable is that in terms of measuring the progression of age?
Well, even that will vary depending on what age measuring you use. And so probably some of those tests are more accurate than the biologic aging tests at the moment. But, depending on what app you use, how much is based on accelerometry, how much is based on your clinical data or some other set of data, you probably get some different results there too. I do think, though, that metabolic health and aging are extremely linked. We know that diabetes accelerates aging, and we know that obesity accelerates aging. And a lot of the interventions that improve metabolism likely affect aging. GLP-1 agonists is a good example of that. Although we don't know for sure yet, it's certainly feasible they could impact aging. It's metformin, etc. So these two things are very intricately linked, and I would suggest to people that if they're really interested in maximizing their health span, metabolism, metabolic health is a good place to start.
Right. And there are quite a few contradictory opinions when it comes to GLP-1 and metformin, and there's a school of thought that believes that it's only effective if you have diabetes or any related condition. And there's another group of individuals and researchers who believe that it can be effective for the larger population as well. What's your take on that?
This is a huge real-world question because a lot of people now are taking metformin even if they don't have hypoglycemia.
Exactly. Yes.
And these GLP-1 SGLT inhibitors, GLP-1 agonists, SGLT inhibitors are being taken like candy. The answer is we don't know for aging. I look at it this way, so it's kind of a hybrid answer to your question. If you are metabolically unhealthy, obesity, diabetes, you're accelerating your age, you're shortening your health span. And these drugs are almost certainly longevity normalizing for those people. So they're bringing their lifespan and health span closer to where it should have been. It's unclear whether for people that don't have metabolic problems, whether these interventions are going to extend the lifespan and be lifespan extending instead of normalizing. We just don't know the answer. The data on metformin and animal models is very weak. Human data, for the most part, is retrospective in metabolic disease patients. So we really don't have enough data in quote-unquote normal patients. And we know even less about Ozempic and some of the SGLT inhibitors. One thing I will say is that if you're taking something that reduces your muscle mass in the long term, it's probably not good for aging. And some of these drugs, not all, but some of them have that side effect. So I would suggest if you have normal metabolism and you're not overweight to probably stay away from these things for now and let us collect some more data over time. I really don't encourage anything that has the potential to reduce your muscle mass.
That's a great piece of advice, and I'm sure it'll resonate with a lot of people who are looking for the answers to these questions. In your opinion, how close are we to having a reliable biological age test that doctors could use?
Well, that's really why we built this clinical aging clock, is that doctors can use it. And we're seeing that impact. We have multiple hospitals trying to work with us now to look at this clock across a wide range of people. The advantage also is that the parameters we're using are sitting in computers in hospitals. These are all the things you measure anyway.
Right.
And if we lack one or two of those measures, we can rebuild the clock without them. So I think that our whole goal here was to do something actionable and get something in the clinic. And it could have some very widespread use. Measuring your biologic age in the population is great. For individuals, it's great. But also, there are lots of hospital issues that are unresolved. I'll give you an example. So you have an older individual that needs a knee replacement. And we know that, as you get older, your response to anesthesia and surgery, it doesn't always decline, but it can be very bad. So people can have cognitive dysfunction after surgery that clears or sometimes doesn't clear. They can have enhanced their frailty after surgery. And it's very hard to figure out who's going to respond well and who's not going to respond well.
Exactly.
So if we have a true biologic aging measure, we might be able to predict who's going to respond well, and it might allow a lot more people to undergo surgery as they get older. So one of the things we're really focused on is we want to extend lifespan and health span in the population. That's the ultimate goal. But how do we find crossover studies we can do that are related to therapeutic things that are happening in hospitals now, where knowing biologic age or using geroprotectors might have an impact. And just to finish the thought, rapamycin, for instance, in our preclinical models, completely suppresses the age-related anesthesia-associated dysfunction in animals. So imagine if you were to give rapamycin or another geroprotector to people that are doing elective surgery for a month before their surgery, and you could mitigate the complications that arise from the surgery, that would have a huge impact. So I think there's, we've often presented this as healthcare versus sick care. Yeah, I think that that's true to a large extent. We're not doing enough healthcare. We need to keep people healthy. But there are areas where these two things, the geroprotective interventions, can cross over into sick care as well and improve treatment. And if we can do that and get widespread use of that in the hospital and the clinic, I think it'll be easier to get the rest of it into where we're really looking at prevention and performance optimization in healthy people.
I think you made a really good point there, and I can relate it to my personal experience. My mom recently went through a knee replacement surgery, and she had two surgeries, one for each knee in a short span of like 2 to 3 days. And she had a very long recovery path because I think she underwent a bout of dementia, and she also suffered from depression, and it took her almost like 6 months to fully recover. So if maybe she was given rapamycin ahead of the surgery, it could have probably made it better for her.
Well, we hope. I mean, of course, we need to do those studies like that in humans. We don't know the answer to that yet, but I think it's an interesting concept, and these geroprotective interventions could be good ahead of cancer treatment to reduce chemotherapy and improve outcomes in oncology. I think there's a widespread use of geroprotective interventions in the hospital, not just in healthy populations.
Right. So if you look at different sort of pathways that are being researched at the moment, there are so many different pathways. For instance, we've got genomic stability and DNA repair, there's cellular senescence, there's epigenetic regulation, there's mitochondrial function or nutrient sensing pathways, and stem cell regeneration or inflammation and immune system decline, metabolic reprogramming. Which pathway are you most excited about, or do you have an opinion on these different pathways?
I think breaking down, I mean, I was part of this problem, so I'll admit to this, but I think breaking down aging into hallmarks and pillars has its strengths and weaknesses.
Yes.
The strength is that it really tells us, that we know some of the pathways that are modulating the aging process. The weakness, though, is that it leads to this idea that if we just fix each one of these things individually, that we're somehow going to be immortal. And yet, when we look at the interventions that work so far, they tend to have an impact on all of the hallmarks or pillars, like rapamycin affects all of the hallmarks of aging, or at least.
Right.
And I think a lot of the other interventions are thought to do that as well. So, while these hallmarks are important to look at as pathways that modulate aging, I think it's really important to remember that they are highly interconnected, and they also become entrained to each other as you get older. And I think that's because the network is breaking down, and there's not crosstalk with these different pathways when the network breaks down. And so everything sort of tends to venture off. And if you do an intervention that preserves the network, it impacts all of the pillars as well. I think it's informative to think about it that way, but we have to understand also that that doesn't mean that we need to individually fix every hallmark, because it's unclear how much that would impact the network as a whole. I think that I will say that every time we do experiments in a discovery-based way, things like inflammation and adult stem cell function keep coming up. So there may be, to us, those are really important early triggers of aging processes.
And I've heard you've been working with Alpha-Ketoglutarate, AKG. What's the story there?
Yeah. From working with a company, Australian Health, that provided resources to several faculty at the bottom when I was there to look for combinations of natural products that would impact aging. And as we screened through things, alpha-ketoglutarate was the clear winner alone. This is a molecule that's a central metabolite, sort of like NAD. It declines with age, and restoring levels back seems to impact the health of animals. In mice, what we found is that it extended lifespan, but only by a little bit. The big effect was on health span. We saw a 50% reduction in frailty as the animals aged. And that's led to a human product, Rejuven, which has a time-release version of AKG and also B-complex vitamins. And if you're a male, low-dose vitamin A, and if you're female, low-dose vitamin D. And that resulted from research showing synergy with those compounds in preclinical models mostly, although we haven't some human data now. I should say I'm involved with that company, so full disclosure. I think that AKG is probably one of the metabolites that's important for aging, and it's an extremely safe molecule to take, and so it may be one way people can enhance their health span and their function as they get older.
Right. And Brian, tell me about the studies you are setting up in Singapore, and what are we hoping to learn from those studies?
I think some of it is really directed at getting validation for which interventions work in which people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one thing you hear now, you start to hear precision longevity medicine. Sure how to do that, yeah. It's certainly the goal. I don't think any intervention will slow aging in everyone. Even exercise, yeah, maybe some form of exercise is good for everyone. But if I give you one prescription for exercise, it's going to benefit some people and hurt other people. We need to know which interventions work in which people. So we're taking an approach mostly using small molecules, drugs, and natural products. Right. And we want to figure out who the responders are and who the non-responders are. And also, I think in a broader perspective, when you think about the field, we've made some huge discoveries in identifying interconnectedness. That's one vertical. Then there's biologic aging clocks. That's another one. Then there's aging hallmarks and pillars. That's another one. And there's outcomes, which are not just disease, but functional decline, things like loss of resilience, etc. But we haven't connected those pillars, especially in humans, particularly well. So we need to know for something like AKG or lipid, the things we're working on, we need to know which biomarkers, which clocks they affect. And that's going to be different for different interventions. Which pathways of hallmarks are most impacted? What are the key outcomes that happen? And that's going to help us identify which people need which intervention and also how to combine those interventions together to get bigger effects. So I think when you go to a longevity clinic right now and they say we're doing precision, they're measuring a lot of things, hopefully, and trying to figure out a baseline on where you are in the aging process. And in some cases, they're identifying that you have high glucose or that you have some cause for medication. And so you could call that precision. You're treating risk factors for disease. I'm not sure whether that's longevity or not. But when it comes to the true longevity interventions that we give to extend health span, I'm not sure we know which ones to give to which people. What effective clinics can do, though, is that they can start people down a path and then bring them back in 3 to 6 months and measure everything again, figure out where they are on that trajectory and whether the intervention is working or not, and then tweak if it's not working ideally. And so I think if you do that and take an iterative process, you can get to precision. But right now, I don't think we can look at the baseline of an individual and come up with a true precision longevity. And that's really important. And hopefully in our academic studies, we can help push things toward that goal.
Right. When you're designing a clinical trial for anti-aging, what's your approach?
Yeah, this is also a big area in the field that I think we don't have all the answers to. So you could take an approach like the TAME trial, which was trying to study metformin and bring in many different sites across academic hospitals, and then look at trying to prevent multiple chronic diseases simultaneously, which is a good argument for what health span is. And that's a good trial design. I think the challenge is that it's extremely expensive long-term prevention studies, and it's hard to do that with 20 or 30 compounds, which is what we should be doing. Yeah, I'm supportive of that study, but I think it's expensive. So what we've tried to do is smaller RCT-based studies, 150, 200 people, 6-month interventions in a middle-aged population, and then look at whether we can influence these biologic aging clocks or other molecular or functional parameters of aging. So we look at a lot of clinical chemistries, we look at muscle strength, we look at vascular function, etc. And we're taking people that don't have overt diseases, but they may be at risk for disease, or they're
Yes,
still healthy, but they're in that age range where they're likely to start getting these chronic diseases in the near future. Is 6 months long enough? I don't think we know yet.
yeah,
Is this the right trial design? I don't think we know that either. You can't standardize how you do things until you get enough data trying different
exactly.
strategies. I think that's where we are in that field right
Also heard about your work with Rejuvenant Life Tabs. What can you share about that?
now. I mentioned Rejuvenant earlier, and with the sustained release Alpha-Ketoglutarate and the vitamins. The company has really made a lot of progress in terms of doing research on this product. For supplement companies, it's really difficult to do lots of research. We tend to complain and say they just market things and don't do research studies. But financially, it's very difficult for them to do that because what drives sales is marketing more than research. So the thing that PDL has really impressed me is that they're committed to actually doing the research
Hmm.
and understanding what the product's doing, what its benefits are. And, we get a lot of individual reports from people saying that they're doing things like getting their care growing
Yeah, wow.
and other things that are consistent with healthy aging. There was one study that was published looking at biologic age using a glyphosate clock. So it's still the Trumi clock, which is still, it's a simpler methylation clock, but the data available suggests it's quite accurate. And we saw a reduction in biologic age with Rejuvenant using that. Doing more follow-up studies now clinically. So I certainly think it's one of the things that people can consider. You really want to be at the cutting edge and really want to try to maximally impact their health span. Other products on the market that may do similar things. But the nice thing about Rejuvenant is that the safety profile of this molecule is extremely high. People have done clinical trials taking AKG at very high doses IV with no side effects. So if you're out there looking for products that are safe and might have an impact, I think it would be a good candidate for that.
And what are your views on the economic and societal impact of slowing down aging, and how can policymakers help promote healthier aging? And if you've seen any examples from policymakers that you found particularly encouraging in this field?
Yeah, I mean, I think though another way of saying it is what are the economic impacts of not doing anything about aging? It's
Very
going
well
to
said.
cost. We don't have enough money to take care of the older population unless we improve their health. There's going to be 2 billion people over the age of 65 by 2050. In Singapore, approaching 1/4 of the population over the age of 65. It's rapidly expanding. I think healthcare systems are designed to do sick care, and countries and regulatory agencies that can make that conversion to balancing true healthcare with sick care will get the biggest benefit. And Singapore's been very good at recognizing the challenge of aging. And so they put money aside to do research on that. I think that they're still struggling a bit to figure out what the right strategy is. And of course, aging can mean all kinds of different things depending on who you talk to. But at least there's an awareness there. Lately, I've seen a lot of growing awareness in China. All the time. The government officials, I think they get it. And of course, China is a huge market for supplements, so the population is very longevity focused already. That might be an emerging country to really take the lead in this process. And, when you look at the US system, it's so disorganized and there's so many perverse incentives that it's really hard to move healthy longevity into practice. Of course, you can go to a clinic and pay money and not get reimbursed and do a lot of these interventions, but on a large scale, democratizing healthy longevity, it may be a challenge in a system like the US. So I think there's an opportunity for other countries to really take the lead here. And the economic benefit is a large number of zeros. It depends on what country you're in and how long you're talking. But even if you extend health span by just 3 years in the population, I think in the US, it's in the tens of trillions of dollars over the next 20 or 30 years. So the benefits are clearly there. And not just money, quality of life.
Exactly.
You don't want to get Alzheimer's and be treated better for it. You want to not get Alzheimer's. And that's what longevity research is about. I think the numbers are there. I think the promise is there. I don't know which interventions are going to work best, but I'm confident some of them will work.
Right.
I think we can get more people toward maximum lifespan. We can extend health span significantly. But we need to really put the resources in to demonstrate that. And their private sector involvement has increased tremendously, and that's great. I work with companies all the time, but we also need governments and regulatory agencies to get with the program and
Right.
understand that every dollar they put into longevity research is probably going to give them more bang for their buck than the money they put into cancer and other things. So I'm not against treating cancer, don't get me wrong, but I do think that we need to balance it with understanding the aging process because it's the biggest risk factor for a decline in health. And right now that balance is tipped so far in the direction of cancer that we need to think a lot about the question of aging.
And do you think addressing aging as a condition is a more preventative or proactive approach as opposed to treating illnesses?
Definitely preventative and proactive, so I agree with you. But I also think messaging sometimes is a because 80% of what you would do for longevity, you would also do for optimizing your performance now.
Yes.
So I'm telling longevity clinics that look, people might come in the door by the idea of slowing aging, but in reality, what you're telling them is in 10 years, you're still not going to be sick. In 20 years, you're still not going to be sick. There is a limited shelf life in people's interests because they're not thinking about what's happening in 20 years. But on the other hand, if you can say to them, look, what we're doing now, we're going to improve your performance, we're going to improve your cognitive performance with lifestyle and maybe supplements and drugs and maybe devices like hyperglycemic chambers. And you're going to benefit from that now. You're going to see those benefits. And on top of that, you're much likelier to be healthy later in life. That's a message people can get behind because they can see the impact of what they're doing. I think that if we focus only on what's happening in the future, it's really hard to keep clients in clinics. But if you're helping them now and in the future, then you can win.
Right. Brian, anti-aging treatments can be pretty pricey, or at least that's the perception. How can we make them more accessible to everyone?
Yeah, well, some of these supplements are not terribly expensive. They're in the range of $50 to $100 a month. And so it's affordable for many people. But then there are other things like stem cell injections and hyperbaric chambers and gene therapy now that cost a lot. And it's not accessible. Everything we do at the university is about democratization. When it comes to intervening in aging or measuring aging, we want things we can scale to the whole Singapore population. But I think what the expensive things are also interesting. And that's one of the reasons we work in clinics. We want to see data on these interventions and figure out what's working. Because if MSCs or some version of stem cells truly slow and reverse aspects of aging, there's economy of scale there. You can scale that process and reduce costs dramatically. And frankly, if you had data that you could extend health span for 5 years and prevent disease, it would be worth insurance companies paying a lot of money for people to do this because the longer they can keep people healthy, the better off we are, and that those people can still be working later in life and engaging in society in ways that are good for the economy. I don't know what's expensive. I think if you had validated data, it's probably worth spending a fair amount of money to give that to the population.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And outside of your own work, what's the most exciting thing happening in aging research right now?
I think it's the transition to studying humans. We, even 5 or 10 years ago, were still heavily focused toward animal models. And there's a lot to be learned from animal models still. One of the things that depresses me in the biomedical research are things like yeast and worms are not getting funded for research. But there's still questions that we can only answer there. And so I think we've run away from that core basic science too much, and we need to get back to asking the basic questions and the organisms that are best suited to answer them. However, there's a tremendous advantage to be doing human studies to complement what we learned in animals. The availability of large data sets, lots of omics, longitudinal records of people's health is really allowing us to understand human aging a lot better. You can really see that change in the last 3 years or so. I think that will only continue, and hopefully it will lead us to the strategies to really intervene for people. I think it will.
Right. Brian, what has been the most rewarding aspect of your work in aging research?
Well, to me, it's always just been the fascination that comes with understanding biology. When you feel like you've learned something, so that's what got me involved in it. It's part of what keeps me involved with it. And science for science sake to me still has meaning. we should
Yes.
we should get away from that. And, I mean, why we age? Can we stop aging? Can we reverse aging? Are there bigger questions in biology than those questions? I mean, this is something that's happening to every single person in almost every species. And I think that trying to understand that process, even if it doesn't necessarily need obvious interventions, is still of high value. They get to sort of the core questions on philosophy of life too. Here for a limited time, etc. What would happen if we could dramatically extend that time? How would society change? All these are fascinating questions, and I think we really need to not lose sight of science for science sake. That's a lot of what keeps me.
What advice would you give to young researchers or entrepreneurs who are interested in aging and longevity field?
I think on the young researcher side, you have to be more versatile than you used to be. You used to be able to focus on one species, on one pathway. You can still do that, but you need to be able to tackle the question from many angles.
Mm.
So I think, you need to learn to code. I don't know how to code.
Yes.
I can hire people that do. I have a math major that's come in very valuable for me. And so, I think that don't focus too much now because even if you're working in worms, you still need to do informatics and having the ability to write programs and things like that is super valuable as we go forward. So be diverse in your knowledge. That's what I would recommend. Ultimately, being successful at research comes down to being driven to answer a question or a set of questions. So you have to find whatever that is that makes you, want to think about it in the shower when you get up. It has to drive you, and of course, there has to be some luck and serendipity that helps you along the way. That's just the truth. From an entrepreneurial side, I think this is a major question, and we've actually started a consulting company to help people deal with these issues. First of all, I think most people understand the promise of longevity right now. And so
Yes.
companies are being started in the biotechnology space, in the supplement space, in the diagnostic space, clinical space, and also just investment funds. All of these things are starting. But it really is the Wild West. And I still think it's very hard for people to know which path is going to be successful. And each of these paths have different problems. In the biotech space, you still can't get a drug reimbursed slow aging because aging's
Exactly.
still not reached disease status. I think it's a semantic argument. If you want to call it a risk factor for disease or you want to call it a disease, it doesn't matter to me as long as you reimburse it because we
Yeah.
know the value of slowing the process. But when you get a biotech company, they may be targeting a pathway of aging like senescence or mTOR, but then they end up having to find disease indications to raise the money to continue into the clinical realm. And this is a difficult balance beam to walk. Where's the true value of measuring aging in these clinical trials? Is it added value? Can you go after aging directly, or do you have to have a disease indication? It's not one size fits all, but that's a big question to try to answer. I think in the supplement and diagnostic space, it's how do you do the research to validate what you're doing and at the same time market the product. Challenges in the clinical space. And so it's a fun time. Look, this is a good time to be an entrepreneur in the space because we don't
Right.
know the solution. And I think that a lot of the investment goes down these cookie cutter paths that, to trying to pigeonhole ideas into pharmaceutical strategies that have been successful in the past. But aging and longevity is not a disease in that sense. So you're not going to wait till people get it, treat it, and then get reimbursed for it. So I would love to see more strategies that are directly designed to target healthspan, but I realize that that's challenging from a funding perspective. So I don't. I, we're learning. I think everybody's learning how to do it, but I would encourage entrepreneurs and researchers to get into the space because the momentum is tremendous. We have an upcoming conference on the physics of aging where we're bringing together theoretical physicists and aging biologists to try to better model the aging process. So there are people coming into the field from all kinds of different realms now, clinicians, coders, hackers,
Mm.
physicists now, and other areas. And so it's great. It's reassuring to see the field growing at that level and to be looking at questions from completely different perspectives now. I think in the end it's going to be extremely promising. It's not easy to point to left field and say, do that, because
Yeah.
figure out what to do.
Brian, many people assume that aging always leads to cognitive decline, but research shows that some types of intelligence, like crystallized intelligence, can improve with age. How can we change the narrative around aging and mental capacity? And what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think I would elaborate even more and say that we have this idea that creativity and entrepreneurship declines with age. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure how much of that is stereotype and how much of that is true. Certain things in your brain change with aging. Your signaling dynamics is slow, but your brain is very good at compensating too. I think that's what you mean, sort of like personalized intelligence or experience-based intelligence. And we would like to say that if we can slow aging, we can have the best of both worlds. People that still have the functional capacity that they did when they were younger and have that experiential knowledge to combine with. So I think there's, it's a bit cliche, but everybody's called this the silver tsunami, but I really think it's a golden opportunity. If we can keep people healthy as they get older, they can combine the wisdom and the creativity and everything in one package. Yeah, people cognitively age very differently. I think that certainly some people get dementia, Alzheimer's, and neurodegenerative diseases, and that's terrible. But people that are still really thoughtful and have interesting perspectives and things. It is a misconception, I think. But this is all part of ageism too. Why do we force people to retire, particularly when the workforce is going to decline? And the last thing we need to be doing is sending people home and having them sit on their couch and not do anything. We need to re-empower older people. We need to educate them. If they want to stay in their jobs and they're effective, they need to be able to do that. We really have to tackle this ageism pretty much in every country because it's going to be more and more of a liability to think that way going forward with so many people in that age group, including me. I'm going to be in the over 65 group in 10 years. I want to be treated.
Studies show that we tend to become more agreeable and happier as we age. How can we leverage these positive changes in older adults to benefit the society?
Yeah. It's kind of a double-edged sword. You also see a rise in things like depression and loneliness.
Yes.
Things with age. So some people go down a great trajectory and other people don't. And it's almost like a bifurcation in some ways. So I think, first of all, we need to tackle this problem. And social connectivity is one big way to do that. People tend to end up living alone, out of contact with their kids. I'm going to visit my parents this weekend, but they're 85 and I don't get to see them that often. It's a challenge. So those are issues, depression that we really need to think about. Thinking about it from different realms could be very, very helpful. I don't want to go down too far down this path, but things like psychedelics have been ignored for a long time in the research field, and they show great promise for things like depression, age-related complications, hospice care. We should be doing the research on those things. They may slow aging too. There's not much data to say one way or the other. But I think you're right. We also need to reinforce the happiness that people feel. People are contented when they get older, which sounds surprising, because when you look at it from an outside perspective and you see that people have declined function or maybe they even have diseases, but they still seem pretty content and happy. I don't think we understand enough about those changes. And in general, I think we have done a good enough job of looking at behavioral function, psychology, cognition in aging, because so much of it has come from the animal models, and it's hard to study those things. It's not impossible, but hard. And so we need to focus more on the psychology of aging, but not in isolation. We need to do it in a way that links it to the biology of aging and what we already know. So that's another case where we need to bring fields together to understand things.
One last question before we conclude our today's episode. If you could leave our listeners with one key takeaway about the future of aging research, what would that be?
I think there's a huge amount of promise for this field, but don't sit around and wait. We know lifestyle change helps, and I recently have been changing my diet. I'm pretty good at exercise. I would give myself an 8 on exercise on a 10, but on diet, I maybe a 6. Not terrible. And compared to most Americans, I'm probably pretty fit. But I'm making slow changes to my diet that I
Mhm.
little things, more yogurt, more nuts instead of sweet, snacks,
Yes.
and I've seen an impact. I'm losing weight, and you can see the benefit of that. So, healthier longevity is attainable now through life. And I also think that some of these supplements, I mentioned one, but there are many others, are benefiting people. So if you want to be on the cutting edge, they're relatively safe things you can do that are likely to have a long-term impact on your health. And so if you're one of these people that wants full validation, you have to wait a few years still. But if you want to, get up in front of it and try things, I think the opportunity's there. I would definitely say don't take 20 different things at the same time
Yeah.
because we see a lot of negative effects when we start combining different interventions right now in animals and we don't understand. But, if you want to pick one or two things, I think longevity clinics can be very helpful in understanding how you're aging, wear the glucose monitor for a couple of
Mhm.
weeks because it tells you how your body responds to what you eat and how you exercise. Gather information. Like, here's another example. Don't ask me whether you should take vitamins. Go figure out what the levels of the vitamins in your body are. And
Yes.
then you'll know which ones you need to move into the optimal range. But, just taking a ton of all these different vitamins is taking some things out of the optimal range into too high ranges, and that's not good either. So you need to do your best to know yourself, and you can get them measuring things like vitamin and micronutrients, measuring clinical parameters, and also doing these aging clocks. The strategy I'm giving you is not cheap, and a lot of it might not be reimbursed. But if you really want to know these things,
Right. That brings us to the end of our today's episode. And what a fascinating journey it has been. Brian, I can't thank you enough for sharing your invaluable insights with us. Your work is truly commendable and at the cutting edge of aging research, and it's both exciting and inspiring to hear about the progress being made in this field. From unraveling the mysteries of Sirtuins to exploring the potential of rapamycin and alpha-ketoglutarate, your research is opening up new possibilities for extending our health span. It's clear that your passion for this work goes beyond the lab, and your efforts to translate these discoveries into real-world interventions are commendable. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Drug Diaries. If you found this conversation as fascinating as I did, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, or share this episode with friends and family. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the frontiers of science and health.